This one is both hard and painful and personal. I haven't talked to my mother since the election. First I found out she voted for Trump, then rationalized it using King David. Then something else transpired and I told her I was so disappointed and that she raised me better than this, and she was just a hypocrite. And then Puerto Rico happened, where it was later estimated that 6,000 American citizens died needlessly. And I told everyone in a post that if you voted for Trump, you were dead to me, and we had a back and forth where I angrily called her out again. She told me it's because she didn't have any real choice because of our two-party system. I had expected her to vote libertarian like always, but she's such a hardcore issues pro-lifer that Pence was enough to make her vote for Trump, the pussy grabber. Though, there were probably other things Pence had done in our government that made the choice an easy one, as we had both been Ron Paul libertarians together for a while. Then the child migration in cages happened, and all the things for being a supposed pro-lifer and a person who had been obsessed with the survivors of the Holocaust and taught me about the evils of the Japanese internment camp. This had to be the thing she spoke out about, and call out her president she voted for, supposedly against her will. I began scanning her feed on Facebook, and this is what I saw. It was an article, and she put in her post a quote from it that said, "Even if a migrant does have credible fear of persecution, there is a legitimate way to pursue that claim, and it does not involve entering the U.S. illegally. First, some people should make their asylum claim in the first country where they feel safe, i.e. Mexico, or some other country they're traversing to get here. Second, if for some reason they are threatened anywhere but the United States, they should show up at a port of entry and make their claim there rather than crossing the border illegally," with the link below. So she was blaming and shaming the parents who were just trying to save their kids from dying, and an arbitrary rule, not even a law, about where they were to seek asylum that was brand new, and the checkpoints were full of armed border agents known to be hostile to Latinos, deemed worthy to have their kids forcefully ripped from them. Well, I lost it. I had tears in my eyes on the way to work. I wrote her a big, emotional 2-page letter that was even more subdued than what I had first wanted to post. Then I let it sit. It was a big thing, and I wanted to make sure I had addressed everything I wanted to say after this long radio silence. I racked my brain trying to think of anything she could come back with, so I could utterly crush any argument she may have had to try and justify her obvious support for a fascist government. Then I realized in my anger I hadn't actually read the article, and that's when the letter became useless. Not because I wasn't right, but because I forgot how well oiled a lie machine the very core of conservatism has. We see Fox News as the head of the conservative movement with blatant, easily debunked lies, but they're not. They're there to trick the gullible masses who had an anti-intellectual bent. They are superfluous fluff from the more sinister pseudo-intellectual machine such as the National Review. After the Great Depression, conservatism was split wide open to show what a horrible lie it was, plunging most of the nation into joblessness and poverty. It was nearly impossible for Republicans to win anything again unless they ran on almost the same platform in the 50s as Democrats later did in the 90s. Then William F. Buckley came along and figured out how to make conservatism cool again. He learned a brilliant tactic to rebuild the movement using ancient sophist-style arguments, where he would collect all the facts he wanted to talk about and ignore the rest and use humans' natural bias toward wanting closure and loving a narrative to close the discussion with the result the way he wanted, or even better, overload it with legal or historical facts, making it a little on the boring side, and it sounds like you are a legal or history expert since the other side isn't talking about it. You have the real truth, and they're all just irrational, hysterical idiots and sheeple. The other side knows this stuff too, but it's less than half the picture. But since you threw that half in the garbage and kept it from your bubble, your readers don't know this stuff. In debate tactics, this is referred to as a galloping gish, or as I called them, a fact bomb, because they're so dense that you're essentially paralyzed in the conversation, and it could take hours or days to find the flaws, blatant lies, context errors, or half-truths mixed in with our actual facts. So the conversation stops and they win. You're picking and choosing college-level complex subjects that back up your claim, but since they aren't getting the entire class, they're completely oblivious to just how much more complex the issue is than you're making it. As complex as it sounds, it is still insanely oversimplified. His magazine, the National Review, was funded by very rich people who wanted people to believe his BS. Ron Paul relied and has always relied on this methodology, why I fell for him whole hog when I first heard him speak on the Google interview back in 2007 and helped spread his ideas. It took me about 3 years to realize that reality was not as neat and black and white, and ignored an incredibly large chunk of reality, and he used tons of dog whistles like his predecessor Barry Goldwater. I and many who followed Dr. Paul were too young or naive to catch them, but since he never directly said anything racist, other than his incredibly racist article that was supposedly written by somebody else, he was scot-free from being a racist, with a clean record. I was sucked in by this. It's so neat, logical, and clean. It just has to be true. I had to learn how to see through my own natural biases, if exploited, to even begin to push my way through and figure out the truth. And I'm not even there yet, but at least I know and I am aware of my own natural biases and how I can be fooled now. Buckley worked hard to purge the party of crazies, like John Birchers, so they could look legitimate and rational again. After Goldwater, they were able to do this, and conservatism grew in the nation to the point that Democrats kept losing so much that Bill Clinton had to run on a much more conservative platform than any Democrat had ever run before. Conservatism took over the nation to the point that after 9/11, the crazy was fully allowed to take over the party again with Fox News and then the many branches of the Tea Party movement. An illusionist closes all doors of possibility until the only answer is the ones he wants you to think. He uses all your natural biases and sensory limitations and bends them to his will so you think you know reality when you don't. So I'll take apart the article piece by piece to explain why it was wrong, but there are so many things right about it that appears to be true. Much like Ron Paul and Alex Jones back in 2007, their facts aren't wrong, their conclusions, however, are terrible. Just as I've said before, liberals take a slice of reality and decide to talk about that, but they know that reality is complex, and you can't talk about all of it. Libertarians and paleoconservatives take a slice of reality, and backwards extrapolate from that slice to logically recreate the rest of reality in the face of obvious contradictions most of the followers are oblivious to, while modern conservatives take a slice of reality and fill the rest in with whatever Fox News says. So, I don't think that anyone, especially that most hardcore academic conservative, could rationalize splitting kids and parents up for the legal act of seeking asylum, but I forgot that these guys are professionals and can figure out some way to make it seem legit, in spite of the blatant atrocities. First off, the article berates the people outraged for being outraged, that it means that they are being irrational, but we are the real rational ones here in our calm, safe space of intellectualism who know the real truth, as the title suggests. First off, it claims, until recently, legal immigrations were just single males from Mexico and not whole families in the past decade fleeing violence. Partly true. Our immigration policy has been all over the map on how accepting and welcoming we are. For most of the nation, we didn't have borders. Then we pushed the native people of southern Arizona and New Mexico down into Mexico and told them they're now Mexicans. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act, where we didn't allow people from East Asia into the nation. Then we had a law until President Johnson that based your chances of getting to immigrate based on your racial hierarchy, and by racial I meant your national race, with Eastern Europeans at the lowest of the white races, but still better than Asians, with blacks and Polynesians at the very bottom. During post-World War II recovery, there was a job shortage, and we invited Mexican labor in, no strings attached. Then in the late Eisenhower administration, there was a shortage of jobs, and he ran Operation Wetback, yes, that is actually its name, and since people in the US at the time didn't have official documents, because this was a free country, and didn't need IDs to live here, many lifelong Americans and native peoples got swept up in the purge and got sent down to Mexico. Johnson ended the eugenics-based immigration law, and that's when we finally started getting immigrants from every country, not just white ones. However, until that point, anyone from the Americas could freely migrate to the United States of America. After that, when the market was good and we had shortages of labor, we'd heartily invite Latinos in. Then when the markets went bad, we would vilify them. But since forcefully removing them, when they paid taxes and didn't get any welfare benefits, which is the case today, would be too expensive and lose the nation money, and they had already put down their roots and were raising a family, we let it slide and were apathetic about it and used them as easy scapegoats when they needed to fire up an angry mob, unless they had committed crimes. Reagan even was for amnesty for people who lived here after a certain amount of time. This is more the fault of government than people. Over time, our path to citizenship became more and more politicized, and there are so many roadblocks to become a citizen, it can literally take 30 to 70 years for someone living here legally on a visa to get citizenship unless you're wealthy. It's why the argument that they need to go back to their home country and wait in line like everyone else and follow the law is not an option. The reality is the line itself is a myth created to allow people safe from violence, a smug way to feel like they who are lucky enough to be born in America to be justified in their dislike of people who should be blaming government for constantly shifting immigrant policies and the blocking of citizenship. Please see the Libertarian write-up on the impossibility of getting a citizenship. If you believe a system is fair, you'll follow it religiously and not question it or rationalize it when it fails. If you believe the system is rigged against you, because all evidence shows you it is, you will ignore it because it's all a rigged game to you. Most of the families fleeing violence at the moment were caused by two things: decades of failed drug policy, where we learned our lesson from the horrors of the booze wars of prohibition in American cities, and exported the drug wars to other countries, where we could just deal with the dealers who brought the drugs from mobs, cartels, and gangs in Central America, which has led to a massive deadly empire for the people there, and with our super lax gun laws here, smuggling and buying arms is so easy for them, they're better armed than the police down there. We are their arms dealers. The other reason is our decade of long policies of messing around with Central American countries and overthrowing their leaders in coups, often for bananas and sugar companies, because Americans really want cheap sugar and bananas. Where the term Banana Republic came from. There were puppet governments we put in place, including under Reagan, so we could get the best deals for their companies. These countries are so full of corruption because we help them stay corrupt for our benefit that now the cartels own the countries like Guatemala, and people will travel thousands of miles through harsh terrain just to reach the United States for asylum because they don't feel safe in Mexico with their cartels either, or they have two other choices: commit crimes for the cartels or die, or worse, have your kids killed in front of you. The next part states, the Trump administration isn't changing the rules that pertains to separating an adult from a child. Those remain the same. Separation happens only if officials find that the adult is falsely claiming to be the child's parent, or is a threat to the child, or is put into criminal proceedings. This is a straight up lie. A, we know that most of the people being separated from their kids are actually family. B, Trump has shrunk the definition of family to a nuclear family and separated kids from their extended family, which is not how most Latino families work. Until the zero tolerance policy came about, they would try and find an extended family member to take care of the kids, only as a last resort when they couldn't find an extended family member or proper foster home. They would have to have temporary shelters for them. And C, until zero tolerance, we didn't make an arbitrary rule that you had to go through a checkpoint and suddenly you were now a criminal, which, by the way, crossing the border illegally is a misdemeanor, but they're being treated like dangerous felons. Before this year, people seeking asylum would cross wherever after traveling thousands of miles through cartels, gangs, and other violence, and immediately find a border agent and ask for asylum. They'd be given food and blankets and water and taken to a refugee shelter and let their asylum process go through. Then Sessions changed the policy to make border points full of heavily armed and aggressively anti-Latino border enforcers the only legal path of entry. At first, last year, it was arbitrary, and then in recent months it was anyone who came in not at the checkpoint. The claim that it's tough and will send a message to people not to bring their kids, but many parents who got deported without their kids were saying, as horrible as this is, at least their kids aren't going to be killed by cartels if they're in government prison camps. That is how desperate these people are. The article plays tricks of legality here as well. When adults are taken in for a crime, they're taken into custody by the U.S. Marshals, while kids are taken care of by Health and Human Services. And because it's become illegal arbitrarily, now all families crossing the border or in the wrong place are now treated as criminals. Next it talks about the courts, but it's leaving out the fact that our courts are understaffed. So the plaintiff gets no legal representation, while the Supreme Court says it's required for non-citizens. Often they have poor translators, and the judge can spend just about 5 to 10 minutes on a case. We have grabbed American citizens who look the right color with social issues like Asperger's and send them to Latino countries because the system is so broken. Here's where they play the biggest lie. That's because of something they called the Flores Consent Decree from 1997. It says that an unaccompanied children can be held only 20 days. A ruling by the Ninth Circuit extended this 20-day limit to children who come as part of family units. So even if we want to hold a family unit together, we're forbidden from doing so. This is a blatant lie as listed below. There's something called executive discretion that has been used by every president before Trump because no law is cut and dry and can be perfectly implemented in practice without breaking some other laws the writers don't think about. As one of several Washington Post articles listed below, the government is required to place these children with family members whenever possible, even if the family members might be undocumented immigrants. Approximately 85% of sponsors are parents who are already in the country or close family members. According to Health and Human Services, some children have no relatives available, in which case the government may keep them in shelters for longer periods of time while suitable sponsors are identified and vetted. Obama just focused on deporting people who broke the law even more draconianly than any of his predecessors since Eisenhower. As the Trump administration's current practice is literal child abuse, as I will discuss in a minute, it is definitely breaking other laws and using executive discretion. He, like every president before him, should have kept the families together and worked on increasing refugee facilities, which it claims there are a shortage of, instead of moving heaven and earth to get more child detention centers. At this point, as soon as the families in crossing the border are sent to camps and systematically separated, often lying to parents to ensure their kids will be given up quietly, like being taken away for a bath, eerily similar to what happened when you arrived at Auschwitz, which is why so many non-conservatives and former concentration camp survivors are freaking out emotionally. Next, it claims that we have to keep them detained or they will escape and not come back for their court date. But in this nation, we're innocent until proven guilty, and ICE is cracking down and taking people into custody who even look tan or speak Spanish, so that catching them again would be fairly easily. Or they could do something like have them wear a surveillance bracelet. Not only that, but most of them who want asylum want to do so legally, and we do have rules for setting up refugee camps, so they could just stay with their kids, but can't escape if we think the person is a flight risk, something judges decide all the time. It ends claiming that the family unit could go home quickly, but liberals want them to stay here longer, and that is only because we believe they deserve a fair trial first. Then it claims they're more economic migrants than asylum migrants crossing the border because liberals have sent the message that they can get in and still be protected. That's neither here nor there and actually a lie. We've been telling them to stay away out of fear for their safety, but that's for a judge to decide. It claims they should make the claim in Mexico or any place they feel safe, and Latino countries don't trust each other as far as they can throw them, thanks to the corruption we help perpetuate, so that idea is out the window. Then it claims that separating families is immoral, but letting families live here while awaiting their hearings is a mockery of justice and therefore even more immoral, and will bring more people and their kids. I can't even argue with this one from a legal argument. I'll get to that in the science part next. Lastly, they use anecdotes that are just garbage as a claim to sway people to think most of the migrants are like that, a tactic that's been used since the invention of the welfare queen myth. There will always be some who break the law, but you have to look at the percentage of system manipulators before you decide to scrap the whole thing, because no system's perfect. The very last thing they claim is that Congress can fix this. A, not true, because this is a policy Trump and Sessions arbitrarily created out of whole cloth, using a Frankenstein collection of laws while ignoring others, and could end it as easily as they started it, and B, this is true, but it won't happen. The Republicans themselves are split on how to fix this, and the House and Senate leaders refuse to bring any bill to the floor that has bipartisan support, and have since Republicans won the House and Senate in 2014, and will only push through the most draconian plans possible. Now, why this law is so horrific to people? The left is treating this like it's the Holocaust, even though there are 0 gas chambers or people worked to death or bullets in the head. Are they losing their minds? No, the difference is that we have better understanding of human brains, thanks sadly in part to survivors of the Nazi regime. Jewish kids who were separated from their parents, even just to get them to safety under the best circumstances, were left with massive emotional scars. During the most formative years, a healthy mind is created by feeling safe and protected. Children have a false but necessary development stage where they can depend on their parents to provide for and protect them all the time. As they get older, they don't need this protection as much, but even then there's still a psychological toll impacted on them. Under 10, the impacts of just being forcefully removed from their parents for 72 hours with no feedback or indication where they are can have lifelong scars. Children, even when reunited with their parents, who were formerly social, inquisitive, and self-actuating, will end up antisocial, having communication regression, constant paranoia, and abandonment issues, be clingy, have crippling anxiety, bedwetting, low self-esteem, become expressionless, have PTSD reactions, learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, and have serious problems with impulse control, and later on have hypertension and heart disease as adults. We know all of this from war zones, children separated by child abuse, and natural disasters, but this policy is needlessly causing this effect on those kids, similar to how government policy gave the kids of Flint lead poisoning, and now they don't have the resources to mentally cope with it, and may never be able to pull themselves up with the tools a kid without this pointless tragedy has. This is like both you and your kids getting permanent brain damage for stealing under $500. This is why we're freaking out and getting angry and perhaps attacking you. It's cruel and heartless and pointless and stupid, and instead of speaking out about this one thing, you're carrying water for him for this life-shattering policy on a massive scale, but it's okay because they aren't Americans and they broke the law. I'm sorry if people haven't been polite discussing this with you. As you recently posted, if you can't be polite about your argument, your opinion is shaky. That's a logical fallacy used to dismiss anyone with any passion, and will ensure that you will never change your mind when an atrocity is happening just because they didn't say it in a tone that made you feel good. And this whole video is why I stopped being a conservative. I spent around 6 hours doing complex research and had a lawyer friend look over it for details to debunk an information-dense article that took literally 15 minutes to read, and that is the point of this entire operation. Jefferson used to complain to Madison and Adams that the American people would just read the Constitution and Black's Book of Law, a Cliff's Notes version of English common law, which our judicial system still runs on, unbeknownst to most Americans, and believe themselves to be a constitutional scholar. Nowadays, people who claim to be constitutionalists haven't even read Black's Book of Law, which is why they don't understand why others interpret, especially liberals, or even 50s conservatives, don't translate or follow the Constitution the way they think it states, as there are limits to even the First Amendment, like shouting fire in a crowded theater. There are always asterisks to every part of the Constitution, where some limit to freedom or unintended conflict of freedoms complicates implementing the law, which is why the court decides to use precedents. But the conservative movement has done their best to keep their base ignorant of all these asterisks and complexities that make law messy and make it seem straightforward and clear-cut. Thinking I had the truth and the simple, straightforward Constitution was being shredded by activist liberal judges made me feel like a patriot and defender of liberty, when I really had a ridiculously oversimplified view of a very complex issue people spend their lives studying. At a certain point, I would read these pseudo-academic articles, then look for the arguments from the other side to get a better context. Then, after getting burned enough by them, I just stopped reading them altogether, to the point that I forgot that they even existed anymore. But if that's required to convince people that the atrocities really are as bad as we are all saying, I will do so. This is a terrible thing our president is doing. Stop supporting it, or the trauma and lifelong damage is on your head.